What if the crown didn't protect you from madness but caused it? Behind every golden throne is a shadow, and in that shadow, betrayal, delusion, and disaster. These are not stories of noble kings and graceful queens. These are the monarchs history tried to forget, because remembering them means remembering how power corrupts, blinds, and sometimes laughs while doing it. From sun gods to sadists, visionaries to villains, here are 30 of the most evil kings and queens and the empires they dragged down with them. Welcome to a royal hall of infamy. You won't leave clean. Before we dive into the madness, make sure you're subscribed because history's darkest corners are only getting deeper from here. And while you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Manila? We want to know who else is up with us, wandering the twisted corridors of the past. Leopold II of Belgium. You wouldn't know it by the beard, the medals, or the Palace de Corbeau. Leopold II of Belgium wasn't just a king. He was, in essence, a private businessman, with a country for a wallet and a continent for a backyard. He had a peculiar hobby, too. While other monarchs built gardens, he built an empire own, not for Belgium, mind you, but for himself. The Congo Free State. Just the name sounds like a marketing pitch. Spoiler, it was neither free nor a state. Leopold was an innovator in the worst way. He figured out how to run a colony without technically involving the government. Through a maze of shell companies and international charm, he convinced Europe he was on a civilizing mission. Civilizing, in this context, meant extracting ivory and rubber with a system that looked suspiciously like, well, let's just say it didn't involve minimum wage or lunch breaks. Back home, he was hailed as a visionary. Statues were built, streets were named. His PR was so polished, you could eat off it. Meanwhile, in the Congo, villages were disappearing. The locals were tasked with meeting impossible quotas. If they didn't, the consequences were strict. But we won't get into the details, only that they involved a kind of fear you don't find in school textbooks. Leopold never set foot in the Congo. He managed it like a remote venture capital investment, hands-off, profits on. Letters to his agents read more like corporate memos than royal decrees. Get more rubber. Expand your reach. Efficiency is key. To him, the Congo wasn't a territory. It was a spreadsheet. And yet, somehow, the world let him keep doing it for over 2 decades. Partly because he was charming, partly because no one wanted to look too closely, and mostly because Europe was in the middle of one of its favorite pastimes, scarving up continents. What made Leopold different was that he wasn't just playing the game, he had written his own rule book. Eventually the stories leaked. Whistleblowers came forward. Missionaries started writing reports that contradicted the tourism brochures. A few photographs surfaced. Public outcry followed. The Belgian government was finally forced to take the Congo away from their own king. That's right. The country had to stage an intervention for their monarch's out-of-control hobby. It was the geopolitical version of telling your uncle to stop flipping houses. Leopold didn't take it well. He tried to scrub his legacy clean before he died. Burned documents, tore up maps, and probably sighed dramatically while doing it. But history has a peculiar habit of leaving fingerprints on even the cleanest gloves. And as for his fortune, it remained very much intact. Today, statues of Leopold still exist. Some have been quietly relocated. Others have been vandalized. A few remain untouched, staring ahead as if nothing ever happened. And maybe that's the most haunting part, though easy it is to wrap atrocity in velvet and call it royalty. But don't worry. If you think Leopold was bad, allow us to introduce you to a man who didn't need a colony to terrorize millions. He only needed a crown, a black-clad secret police, and a simmering rage that even history books tread lightly around. Ivan IV, the Terrible of Russia. In Russia, history doesn't whisper, it growls. And in that cold, howling timeline, no growl is louder than that of Ivan IV, better known by his unfortunate nickname, the Terrible. Though, to be fair, in 16th century Muscovy, terrible didn't mean bad at math or awkward in conversation. It meant awe, inspiring, wrathful, possibly divinely terrifying, which was accurate. If kings were weather systems, Ivan was a blizzard with a vendetta. He started young. Crowned at just 16, Ivan decided to skip the typical monarchical warm-up routine. Instead, he declared himself Tsar of all Russia, new title that blended the authority of Caesar with the enthusiasm of a boy let loose in a military surplus store. It wasn't just a fancy name. It was a statement. I am not like other rulers. I am the ruler. And for a time, that ambition led to reforms, modernization, legal codification, even infrastructure projects. For a brief, shimmering moment, it seemed Ivan might go down in history as Ivan the Bold, Ivan the Builder, Ivan the Not-So-Bad. Then things got weird. Personal tragedy knocked something loose. After the sudden death of his beloved wife, Anastasia, Ivan began to suspect everyone of foul play. Boyars, noble families, courtiers, clergy. Anyone who looked at him sideways suddenly seemed like part of a vast, invisible conspiracy. And when you're an absolute monarch with a flair for paranoia, invisible conspiracies tend to end up very visibly punished. Enter the Oprichnina, Ivan's personal terror squad. Dressed in black, riding black horses, and reportedly carrying severed dog heads as symbols of loyalty and, let's be honest, subtlety, these men were not your average medieval civil servants. Their job was to root out treason. Their method was to assume that treason was, in fact, everywhere. Towns were raided, nobles disappeared, entire regions were depopulated. The most infamous episode? The massacre of Novgorod, a flourishing city that made the mistake of looking self-sufficient. Ivan believed it was planning to defect to Lithuania, so he responded like any rational statesman would, by unleashing weeks of torture, looting, and destruction. By some estimates, tens of thousands died, and Novgorod was never the same. But it wasn't just enemies who suffered under Ivan. Friends, family, even his own blood weren't safe. There's a famous story painted, dramatized, whispered of Ivan striking his eldest son in a fit of rage. The blow proved fatal. A tragic accident, perhaps. Or just another reminder that the Tsar's throne was surrounded by shadows. Ivan's foreign policy was just as chaotic. He plunged Russia into the Livonian War, a decades-long conflict that drained resources, depopulated regions, and left the country more vulnerable than when it began. His obsession with expansionism often eclipsed practicality. Think of a man trying to paint a mural while the ceiling is collapsing and then blaming the brush. By the end of his reign, Russia was exhausted, its treasury empty, its people frightened, and its nobility gutted. Ivan himself? A hollowed-out shell of a ruler who dabbled in mysticism, surrounded himself with sycophants, and alternated between repentance and rampage. He died while playing chess, which sounds dignified until you realize it's the most peaceful thing he ever did. And yet, Russia remembers him. Statues exist. He even has a cathedral saint. Basil's commissioned under his rule, still standing in Moscow's Red Square, like a fairy tale built on scorched earth. He unified Russia, yes, but at what cost? Underneath every accomplishment lies a grave. Or several. But just when you think you've seen what absolute power does to a man, you meet someone who didn't just rule with an iron fist. She ruled with ritual trials, poison ceremonies, and a royal paranoia so intense it rewrote an island's entire population chart. If you're still with us after that descent into royal terror, you're exactly the kind of person we like around here. So hit that subscribe button, you clearly have a taste for the strange. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Are you in bed in Boston, or wide awake in Warsaw at 2 a.m.? We see you, night owls. Keep going, things only get darker from here. Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar. If Ivan IV was a storm that rolled across Russia, Queen Ranavalona, I was something slower and strangera thick, creeping fog that smothered a kingdom over decades. From a distance, her reign looks like a footnote in global history, but zoom in, and you find one of the most surreal and quietly devastating regimes ever to emerge from an island. Ranavalona wasn't born to rule. She was born into a turbulent Madagascar where kings rose and fell, depending on who had the loudest drums and the sharpest knives. Her father, a commoner, helped prevent an assassination attempt against King Andrianampoina Marina, which turned out to be an excellent career move. The king, out of gratitude, adopted Ranavalona into the royal household. Years later, with a few lucky breaks and strategic alliances, she would inherit the throne after her husband's death by maneuvering faster than anyone else in the room. Political Chess, Island Edition. She ruled from 1828 to 1861. That's 33 years, 3 decades of pure, undiluted control. No co-monarchs, no advisory councils with veto power, just Ranavalona. And her vision for Madagascar was clear. Absolute independence from foreign influence. Especially European. Especially Christian. Especially anything that smelled like civilizing mission. At first glance, that sounds noble. A sovereign queen defending her culture from colonizers? A rare plot twist in the 19th century. But this wasn't defiance as diplomacy. It was defiance as doctrine. Ranavalona didn't just expel missionary Esh, he outlawed Christianity altogether. Converts were given options, public renunciation or something far less pleasant. Traditional rituals replaced imported religion, and courts held elaborate ceremonies to determine guilt through tangina, an ordeal involving poison and chicken. Yes, chicken. It's complicated. And no, the survival rate wasn't great. The Queen also cut ties with nearly every Western power. Foreign merchants were expelled, treaties revoked, and borders closed. Industrialization? Not on her watch. She saw every European machine, book, and blueprint as a Trojan horse. Progress wasn't just paused, it was thrown into reverse. The island, once on the verge of opening to the world, became a geopolitical time capsule. And then there were the internal purges. Every monarchy has them, but Ranavalona elevated suspicion into an art form. Courtiers were accused of plots. Nobles vanished. Forced labor became institutionalized, and infrastructure projects, especially defensive fortifications, ate up entire villages of workers. Few returned. Those who didn't talk about it. You don't look a gift queen in the eye, especially one who believes that disloyalty is hereditary. To her supporters, she was a lioness unyielding, nationalistic, a bulwark against foreign domination. To others, she was a tyrant with a charming smile and a death count that no one dared calculate. Some estimates say 1 million people perished during her reign through starvation, punishment, forced labor, or exile. Whether or not the number is precise, the sentiment is. Madagascar was not the same after Ranavalona, and in many ways, it never recovered. Her later years were a strange mix of isolation and ceremony. She grew increasingly reclusive, increasingly suspicious, but never lost her grip on power. Foreign envoys were turned away. Letters from Europe went unanswered. The world moved on, but Madagascar stayed fixed-held in place by one queen's obsession with purity, identity, and absolute rule. She died in 1861, peacefully in her bed, after 33 years of unchallenged reign. The silence that followed her death must have sounded like thunder. Her successor, a relative far more open to modernization, immediately reversed most of her policies. Treaties were signed, missions returned, schools reopened. But for a generation, an island had existed as a kingdom apart, its people held in a frozen dance between tradition and terror. And just when you think you've seen what a monarch can do to their own land, along comes someone who didn't just dominate a kingdom but casually erased civilizations, one siege at a time, with no remorse and no memory of mercy. Genghis Khan. There are conquerors and then there are natural disasters that just happen to ride horses. Genghis Khan, born as Temujin, didn't just shape the world. He steamrolled it, not metaphorically. Entire cities, nations, empires flattened like pages in a history book. No one was allowed to reread. And yet, he began with absolutely nothing. No kingdom, no army, just a blood feud, a chip on his shoulder, and an uncanny ability to turn tribal chaos into global catastrophe. Temujin came from the Mongolian steppes, a place where childhood wasn't a face-it, was survival training. After his father was poisoned by rivals, his family was abandoned by their tribe. They lived on scraps, roots, and the occasional stolen fish. It was less a childhood, more a harsh tutorial in betrayal and resilience. And Temujin learned fast. Loyalty was fragile. Trust was currency. And power? Power came to those who expected nothing and took everything. When he rose, he didn't rise gently. He didn't inherit a throne, he forged one with iron and fire. Clan by clan, he united the fractious Mongol tribes, not through polite negotiation, but through a mixture of charisma, cunning, and a demonstrated willingness to make examples of people. His leadership philosophy was simple. If you resisted, you vanished. If you submitted, you prospered sometimes. No guarantees. By 1206, he was crowned Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. The title was less a declaration than a spoiler. What followed was the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. China, Persia, Central Asia, Eastern European border was safe, no fortress permanent. The Mongol army moved like smoke and struck like thunder. They traveled light, fought hard, and brought with them a playbook of strategy that made traditional armies look like marching bands. But it wasn't just the military that made Genghis terrifying. It was the psychology. His campaigns were more than battles, they were performances. If a city surrendered, it was spared. If it didn't, it became a cautionary tale. Rumors of Mongol cruelty spread faster than the armies themselves, and the rumors often exaggerated nothing. People fled at the sound of hoofbeats, sometimes abandoning entire regions. The Mongol advance became a kind of contagious fear, and that fear was strategic. And yet, because history is never content to be simple, Genghis Khan was also, in some ways, a reformer. He established a postal system, enforced religious tolerance, created a legal code, and promoted meritocracy in his ranks. He abolished the kidnapping of women, centralized administration, and even developed a census. His empire wasn't just a horde, it was a machine. An engine of empire powered by discipline, logistics, and raw momentum. But for all its order, Genghis's empire was forged in ash. Civilizations collapsed under his rule. Irrigation systems were destroyed, books burned, languages lost. The body count from his conquests stretches into the tens of millions, though no exact number survives, partly because some of the people affected no longer existed long enough to write things down. His armies didn't just kill, they erased. Still, his legacy refuses to sit neatly on one shelf. In Mongolia, he's revered as a founding father. Across parts of Asia, he's remembered as a harbinger of devastation. His face has been on coins, vodka bottles, and action figures. In one era, he was considered the scourge of civilization. In another, the father of globalization. He died in 1227, cause uncertain. Some say battle wounds, others claim a horse accident, and a few whisper stranger tales of secrets buried with him so deep that even today, archaeologists search in vain for his tomb. His final resting place remains unknown, hidden by forests, legends, and a deeply embedded fear of being found. But if Genghis Khan represented war as strategy, the next name in history's rogues gallery embraced destruction as a statement. His empire was built on spectacle towers of skulls, rivers of fire, and cities wiped clean not by accident, but by design. Tamerlane, Timur. If Genghis Khan was the storm that shattered continents, Tamerlane, known formally as Timurwas, the architect of ruin. He didn't just conquer, he curated devastation. Where others might sack a city and move on, Timur would linger just long enough to admire the rubble, stack the skulls, and make sure the smoke rose evenly. His empire, like his reputation, was built from the bones of civilizations. Timur was born in the 14th century in what is now Uzbekistan, centuries after Genghis, but deeply in his shadow. He claimed descent from the Great Khan, though the paperwork was a little fuzzy. Still, he didn't let genealogical ambiguity slow him down. Where others saw legacy, Timur saw blueprint. He would finish what Genghis started, but with more flair, less pragmatism, more symbolism. Fewer borders, more blood. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Timur didn't begin as a king. He began as a warlord with a limp wounded in battle or by a childhood accident, depending on which story you believe. Hence his nickname, Timur the Lame. It should have been a disadvantage. Instead, it became branding. He turned his limp into legend, the kind that whispers through campsites and courtrooms alike. If that man limps toward you, run. His rise was not subtle. Timur understood that power doesn't wait for invitations. Through cunning alliances, betrayals, and brutal efficiency, he carved out control of Transoxiana, a region that now sounds poetic, but back then meant trade routes, wealth, and the perfect launch pad for empire. From there, he expanded like a fire with ambition. Persia, Mesopotamia, India, the Caucasus, Syria, parts of Turkey. Even the edges of Russia felt his heat. And yet, Timur wasn't just a conqueror. He styled himself a restorer of order, of civilization, of Islamic greatness. But his definition of restoration involved a lot of demolition. When Baghdad resisted him, he laid it waste. When Delhi stood proud, he broke it open. The city of Isfahan once displeased him, so he allegedly ordered tens of thousands executed and had their heads stacked in neat symmetrical pyramids. Not because he had to, because he wanted people to remember. And people did. Because Timur's destruction wasn't random, it was messaging. You could call it psychological warfare. You could also call it theater. A city destroyed wasn't just punishment. It was an announcement to the next city. We're ahead of schedule. Don't resist. Yet even amid the carnage, Timur fancied himself a patron of culture. He loved scholars, poets, architects. He built a capital Samarkand that gleamed with turquoise domes and intricate mosaics. After reducing entire regions to ash, he'd summon artisans from the rubble to decorate his palaces. Some call this contradiction. Timur probably called it balance. His court was a bizarre paradox, beauty wrapped around brutality, literature nestled beside tyranny. He quoted philosophers while commissioning sieges. He listened to poetry while drafting conquest. He believed in divine purpose, especially his own. To him, the universe had given him a mission, not to rule peacefully, but to reshape the world with sword and fire. He died in 1405, on his way to invade China, because of course he wasn't finished. The earth probably sighed in relief. His empire, stitched together through terror and loyalty, both real and manufactured, began to unravel soon after. But his legacy endured in ruins, in monuments, in the quiet caution of future rulers who studied him and decided maybe moderation wasn't such a bad thing after all. Today, Timur is remembered in different lights. In some places, he's a hero founder, a visionary, a protector of art. In others, he's a ghost haunting ruins that still haven't healed. But one thing is certain. When Timur marched, history didn't walk beside him. It trembled. And yet, Timur still believed in some higher order. He feared judgment, divine or otherwise. Not so the next man in our hall of haunted crowns, a ruler who replaced reason with vanity, fiddled while cities burned, and turned personal insecurity into imperial instability. Nero of Rome. If Rome was a stage, then Nero was its most committed actor, and the tragedy he performed was real. His reign wasn't just misrule, it was misrule wrapped in theater, tied with delusion, and set to music he probably composed himself. History remembers him in shades of firelight, tuning his lyre as the empire smoked behind him. And while that story is debated, the man behind the myth still stands tall in the ruins, part artist, part tyrant, all ego. Nero became emperor young, around 17, which is exactly the age you don't want to hand absolute power to any, especially someone raised in a palace by an ambitious mother with a vendetta and a philosopher tutor who kept handing him ethics lectures like breath. Mints. His mother, Agrippina, had schemed her way into the imperial bloodstream, possibly through poisoning, definitely through manipulation. She expected to rule through her son like a puppeteer. But Nero was no puppet, just a different kind of problem. At first, things were oddly promising. He cut taxes, banned capital punishment, and gave moving speeches in the Senate. A golden boy, they said, until the gold started to flake. Slowly, erratically, Nero stopped listening to advice and started listening to applause, but not from senators or generals, from audiences, because Nero didn't want to be remembered as a ruler. He wanted to be remembered as an artist, which, for an emperor, is a red flag. He loved performing, singing, acting, even competitive poetry. He forced Rome's elite to sit through his plays, his recitals, his endless monologues, and they had to clap, laugh, weep, whatever the script demanded. Some tried to fake fainting just to escape. Others endured in silence, knowing that a poorly timed yawn could be a death sentence. Nero didn't tolerate critics, he barely tolerated pauses. And that brings us to the fire. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE burned for nearly a week, leveling huge sections of the city. People fled, temples collapsed, livelihoods vanished. In the chaos, The rumor spread. Nero started it. Why? Because he wanted room to build a new palace? Or because he liked the visual? Or because he wanted to see his poetry brought to life in flame? None of these were proven, but the whispers stuck, and Nero, ever the improviser, panicked. To redirect blame, he looked for scapegoats. He found them in a new, suspiciously loyal group known as Christians. Strange customs, secret meetings, and refusal to worship Roman gods made them easy targets. Nero launched the first official persecution. Arrests, public punishments, executions, all very theatrical, and all calculated to reassure a frightened population that their emperor was in control. Not guilty, just decisive. But the paranoia didn't stop. Nero began eliminating those closest to him. His tutor, Seneca, gone. His wife, replaced, then remembered, then mysteriously gone. His mother? Well, let's just say the family dinners grew tense, then terminal. Each death was justified with a new justification: treason, disrespect, inconvenience. It didn't matter. Nero had become emperor, judge, and playwright, and everyone else was a character he could write out. Eventually, the empire cracked under the strain. Revolts broke out. Generals turned. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state. Nero, abandoned and hiding, still fancied himself a tragic hero. According to legend, his last words were, "What an artist dies in me." Not what a ruler, not what a leader, just a man who always saw himself in the spotlight, even as the curtain fell. Today, Nero's name is a shorthand for chaos, vanity, and ruin dressed in velvet. Statues were pulled down, his memory condemned. But like all well-written tragedies, he lingered. You don't forget a ruler who tried to turn government into performance art and nearly succeeded. Still, Nero was but one act in Rome's long drama of decadence. Because, just a few decades later, another emperor would risen not with a flute or a fiddle, but with a taste for spectacle, cruelty, and moral decay so absolute it made Nero look like a warm-up act. Caligula of Rome. There are bad rulers, and then there's Caligula Rome's most chaotic overachiever in the fine art of imperial unraveling. If Nero was a misguided artist playing emperor, Caligula was a carnival mirror come to life-distorting power into something so warped, so gleefully unhinged, that even Roman historians struggled to describe it without sounding like they were writing satire. Spoiler, they weren't. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he was nicknamed Caligula as a child by soldiers who adored him. It meant little boots, a cute name from hardened legionnaires who'd watched him toddle around in miniature armor. It stuck. So did the symbolism. Because behind the nickname was a boy raised in the shadow of imperial paranoia. His family was royalty respected, feared, and, unfortunately, constantly under suspicion. His father, Germanicus, died under mysterious circumstances. His mother and brothers were accused of treason and died in exile or prison. Caligula survived barely and learned one thing. In Rome, trust was currency you spent once. When Tiberius, the grim and brooding emperor before him, finally died, Caligula was next in line. Rome rejoiced. A fresh face, a link to the beloved Germanicus, a return to sanity. For the first few months, it seemed the celebrations were justified. He released prisoners, paid bonuses to the military, held public games, wiped away years of repression with smiles and parades. And then something cracked. Whether it was a sudden illness, untreated trauma, or the realization that absolute power meant he could do literally anything, Caligula transformed from Rome's darling into its waking nightmare. The cheerful prince became a man who made tyranny feel like performance art, with himself as the star, the director, and the only one allowed to laugh. One of his favorite hobbies? Public humiliation. Senators, generals, nobles, no one was safe. He'd invite them to banquets, then ridicule them mid-meal, sometimes forcing them to dance or act out plays. Not optional. And, if someone hesitated or looked confused, Caligula had a solution. Exile, execution, or something. Creative. The line between joke and judgment was invisible. His court became a theater of dread, where every applause might be your last. Then came the declarations. He was a god, he said, living, breathing, and divine. Temples were rededicated in his name. Statues of Jupiter were remodeled with Caligula's own face. He demanded people address him as a deity and consulted the moon for advice. Sometimes he'd hold conversations with statues. Other times he'd answer his own questions aloud, just to ensure the dialogue remained on script. But perhaps his most infamous decision, on that scholars still debate with furrowed brows and long sighs, was his alleged plan to make his favorite horse Incitatus a consul. Not a joke, not a metaphor. He built the horse a marble stall, a jeweled collar, and scheduled banquets in its honor. Some believe it was satire, mocking the Senate's incompetence. Others think he was serious. Either way, Rome got the message. Your emperor answers to no one, not even logic. Despite the insanity, Rome endured. But behind the scenes, fear curdled into action. After just 4 years of rule, 4 years of carnivals, cruelty, and public absurdity, Caligula was assassinated by his own guards. Not rebels, not rivals, his personal protectors. They'd had enough. The blade was swifter than the Senate. Caligula's body was dumped, buried in secret, and his name scraped from records. For a time. But Rome never forgets. Especially when the scars are funny, strange, and horrifying all at once. And if Caligula was the emperor who thought himself a god, our next monarch may have imagined himself something even higher, the final authority over life, death, and destiny in a corner of the ancient world where prophecy and politics walked hand in hand. A ruler so paranoid he struck down his own bloodline, all in the name of order, perhaps just fear. 7 rulers in hand. If you're still watching, you're clearly not afraid of a little historical darkness, so why not make it official? Hit that subscribe button and join the growing crowd of late-night truth seekers. And while you're here, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you? Is it dusk in Dubai or dawn in Detroit? We're building an empire of insomniac's own twisted tale at a time. Herod the Great of Judea. It's ironic, really. Herod, the great architect of temples, rebuilder of cities, master of political tightrope walking, is remembered less for his construction than for his destruction. His name lives on, not in the beauty of the Second Temple, nor in the fortresses he carved into hillsides, but in whispers of fear, betrayal, and a paranoia so dense it made family dinners an exercise in strategic silence. Herod wasn't Roman, but he wasn't quite Jewish royalty either. He was Idumean, a region south of Judea, and that inconvenient ancestry never quite sat right with the locals. But Rome didn't mind. Rome liked Herod. He was efficient, loyal, brutal when needed, and most importantly, he didn't ask too many questions except maybe about who was plotting against him. Which, to be fair, was usually everyone, or at least that's what he believed. His rise to power was less about divine right and more about strategic endorsements. Julius Caesar gave his father a nod. Then Mark, Antony, and Cleopatra came into play. And when things got dicey, Herod jumped ship and swore loyalty to Octavian, soon to be Augustus. Herod had a gift, surviving power struggles without getting his toga dirty. Rome eventually named him King of Judea. A puppet, perhaps, but a puppet with a sword and a building permit. Once crowned, Herod went to work, not just politically, cosmetically. He wanted Judea to shine, to impress Rome, to become a jewel that sparkled just right from the imperial balcony. He renovated the temple in Jerusalem, turning it into one of the most magnificent structures of the era. He built cities, ports, palaces, Caesarea, Masada, Herodium, all stamped with his signature flair, opulence with a side of overcompensation. But beneath the limestone grandeur was a man who trusted no one, not his allies, not his priests, and certainly not his family. Herod's domestic life was a rotating cast of tragedy, accusation, and sudden disappearances. He had 10 wives, 10 and many children. But love in Herod's palace was never unconditional. One of his favorites, Mariamne, came from the Hasmonean dynasty, the previous Jewish ruling family. Her connection to royal blood made her both a perfect queen and an existential threat. Eventually, Herod became convinced she was plotting against him. Or maybe someone told him she might. Or maybe he just couldn't stand not knowing. So he had her executed. Then her mother. Then, eventually, 3 of his sons. One by one, those closest to him fell under suspicion, were tried, and never returned. It became a pattern. You could measure time in funerals. Roman Emperor Augustus, no stranger to imperial suspicion, himself allegedly quipped that it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son. A joke steeped in cultural irony, since Herod followed kosher laws. The pigs were safe, the children less so. And then there's the legend that sealed Herod's reputation in stone, the so-called massacre of the innocents. According to a later Christian tradition, Herod, upon hearing that a newborn king of the Jews had been born in Bethlehem, ordered the killing of all male infants in the area, historically debated. Theologically potent. Whether or not it happened, the fact that the story made sense to people says a lot about how Herod was perceived, the kind of man who might do something like that and maybe already had. Herod died in agony, plagued by illness and isolation. His final years were spent writing and rewriting wills, trying to control the chaos he had carefully engineered for decades. When he finally passed, no one wept too loudly. He had arranged for prominent citizens to be executed on the day of his death so that there would be mourning in the streets. Fortunately, that order was ignored. But the fact that he gave it? Classic Herod. He left behind ruins and monuments, testaments to ambition, anxiety, and absolute authority. His legacy? A kingdom that didn't mourn its king, and a people who remembered his name not with reverence, but with caution. Yet for all of Herod's architectural obsessions, his paranoia stayed local. The next ruler on our descent into tyranny wasn't content with localized fear. He wanted the whole nation bathed in ideological blood, and when he gave the order, the rivers didn't run red. They ran systematically. Charles IX of France. If some rulers are born tyrants, Charles IX of France might be considered an accidental one. Not because he didn't spill blood, he did, in volumes, but because he never quite seemed to know whose hand was on the dagger. His? His mother's? The crown's? History has a hard time deciding. What is certain is that during Charles's short and haunted reign, France found itself soaked in the blood of its own people, and the echoes of that betrayal still ring out like a funeral bell for trust. Charles wasn't supposed to rule, not really. He was the 3rd son, a backstage royal, the kind who's raised to be polite, educated, and unimportant. But fate and illness thinned the line of succession. And in 1560, at just 10 years old, Charles was crowned King of France. But don't picture a golden-haired child raised on gentle lullabies and courtly hand-holding. His mother was Catherine de' Medici, part lioness, part political strategist, part walking Renaissance chessboard. She didn't raise sons. She maneuvered them. At the time, France was in religious meltdown. The Protestant Reformation had split Europe, and France had become a powder keg of sectarian rivalry. Catholics versus Huguenots, neighbor versus neighbor, scripture versus scripture. Violence flared. Peasants picked sides. Cities turned into battlegrounds. The monarchy's job? To calm the storm while staying dry. Not easy when every courtier had a Bible in one hand and a knife in the other. Catherine, the Queen Mother, tried to balance it all, shuffling marriages, treaties, and edicts like a medieval card trick. And Charles? He nodded, listened, tried to keep up. But the crown sat too heavily, and Catherine's shadow grew too long. He ruled, but only as a reflection of her ambition and fear. And it was fear real or imagined that led them both to their darkest hour. In 1572, a fragile peace was arranged between Catholics and Protestants. Part of the deal was a marriage between Charles's sister, Marguerite, and the Protestant leader, Henry of Navarre. A royal wedding, the kind designed to heal wounds with flowers and feasts. Protestant nobles flooded into Paris for the celebration. It was, for a moment, hopeful. Then came the Whisper Campaign. A failed assassination attempt on the Protestant Admiral Gaspard de Coligny shook the court. Catherine claimed it was a Protestant plot. Others claimed it was her own doing. Charles panicked. Rumors spiraled. The Queen Mother advised swift, decisive action to protect the crown. And so, on the night of the 23rd of August, 1572, St. Bartholomew's Eve, the gates of Paris were closed. The bells tolled. And the killing began. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre wasn't a riot. It was coordinated, calculated, and terrifyingly thorough. Soldiers dragged Protestant nobles from their beds. Entire families were executed in the streets. The Seine ran thick. By dawn, the murders had spread beyond Paris, rippling across the French countryside. Over the following weeks, thousands were deadsome, estimate as many as 10,000. And Charles? According to some accounts, he gave the order, himself shouting in a fit of fury that not one Huguenot should be left alive. According to others, he was manipulated, cornered, and shattered by the aftermath. What we do know is this: the massacre haunted him. He withdrew, grew sickly, paranoid. Terrified of shadows and spirits and poisoned cups, he was just 23 when he died, coughing blood, raving about guilt, visions, and phantoms. France never forgot. The massacre became a wound in the national psyche, a symbol of betrayal so deep it fractured not just families, but faith itself. Charles IX's legacy isn't his policies or reforms, it's a single night, soaked in trust betrayed. But if Charles was a boy king lost in his mother's war, the next sovereign needs no excuses, no shadows, no whispers. She earned her name in flames and wore it proudly because for her, mercy was heresy, and purification came with the smell of smoke. Mary I of England. History gave her a name, and she didn't bother correcting it. Bloody Mary, a moniker soaked in firelight and screams, whispered by children in darkened bathrooms centuries later, long after the executions stopped and the smoke cleared. But before the legend, before the nickname, before the bonfires of human belief, Mary Tudor was a girl with a broken lineage and a cracked crown, clinging to faith like it was the last solid thing in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, a union that England once celebrated as divine and later outlawed like a bad habit. Her father's desperation for a male heir and a fresh wife turned Mary's entire existence into a scandal. One minute, she was a princess, The next, she was declared illegitimate. Her mother was cast out. Her titles vanished. And Mary learned early that royal favor was conditional, and that God, unlike kings, didn't change his mind every Thursday. Raised Catholic in a newly Protestant nation, Mary grew up as a walking contradiction, royalty by blood, outcast by decree, a threat to the very reforms she was expected to follow. Her half-brother, Edward VI, came to power after Henry's death and pushed England further into Protestantism. Mary resisted quietly at first, then with increasing resolve. When Edward died young, Protestant advisors tried to install Lady Jane Grey, a teenage pawn with royal ties, as queen. Mary wasn't having it. She raised an army. She marched on London. The people, weary of schemers and ready for anything with a Tudor bloodline, rallied to her side. Mary entered the capital not as an exile, but as a conqueror. And once she sat on the throne, she didn't just rule, she corrected, or tried to. And correction, in her mind, meant one thing: return to Rome. Her first steps were cautious. She repealed Protestant reforms, restored papal authority, and tried to ease the country back into Catholic obedience. But tolerance wasn't really part of the royal toolkit. When resistance arose, and it did, loudly Mary turned to fire. Not metaphorically, literally. Beginning in 1555, Protestant leaders were arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake. Some were scholars. Others were preachers. Many were simply citizens who clung to the Book of Common Prayer like it was the only rope left in a rising tide. The executions were public, theatrical, and meant to send a message. Heresy would not be debated. It would be purified with heat. In total, nearly 300 people were burned during her 5-year reign. It wasn't the largest purge in European history, not by far, but it was enough to turn her image from reformer to tyrant, enough to make her name synonymous with smoke and screaming. The English didn't forget. The scent lingered in their clothes, in their churches, in their bedtime stories. And it didn't help that Mary's other policies were equally unpopular. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain, an alliance meant to restore Catholic unity, was seen as a betrayal. Foreign influence, foreign ambitions, and, worst of all, no child, no heir. Just a phantom pregnancy, a nation's hope swelling and then collapsing in grief and embarrassment. Mary believed she was doing God's work. The people began to wonder if God had stepped out of the room. She died in 1558, aged 42, worn down by illness and disappointment. Her half-sister Elizabeth succeeded Herent, promptly reversed almost everything Mary had done. The fires were extinguished. Protestantism was restored, and Mary, once queen, became a warning. Bloody Mary was never meant to be a fairy tale. But history made her one NEA complete with flames, shadows, and the echo of prayers no one dared say too loud. Yet her story is far from the worst England would endure, because the next monarch didn't bring a religious purge or a war of ideas. He brought a quiet Collapsian empire rotting from the top down, while he fiddled with family portraits and ignored the smoke rising just outside the palace gates. Nicholas II of Russia. There's a special kind of tragedy reserved for monarchs who don't realize the world has moved on without them. Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, didn't just miss the memo, he set it on fire, built a palace out of the ashes, and then wondered why the foundation kept shaking. His reign wasn't marked by flamboyant cruelty or violent spectacle. It was something quieter, slower, and in many ways more dangerous. A lethal blend of stubborn tradition, catastrophic denial, and a refusal to believe that absolute power could expire. Born into a dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 3 centuries, Nicholas inherited an empire that was already creaking at the joints. Industrialization was incomplete. The nobility lived like minor deities, while the peasantry lived like dust. His father, Alexander III, ruled with iron and certainty. Nicholas, he ruled with hesitance and hesitation. Even his own cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, once called him a man who means well but changes nothing. He never wanted to be Tsar, not really. But when the crown landed on his head in 1894, he accepted it like someone accepting a job offer from a ghost out of duty, not vision. He saw himself as a paternal figure, chosen by God to shepherd the Russian people. But his version of fatherhood was distant, blind to suffering, and pathologically resistant to reform. While the rest of Europe danced into the 20th century with constitutional monarchies and political revolutions, Nicholas clung to autocracy like it was an antique family heirloom that still held value. Then came the cracks. In 1905, protests erupted. Peasants, workers, and students marched peacefully to present a petition to the Tsar, asking for basic rights wages, representation, dignity. They brought icons, not weapons, and they were met with bullets. Bloody Sunday, they called it. The Tsar wasn't even there, but his absence felt like an answer. Trust collapsed overnight. A wave of strikes and revolts spread across the empire. Nicholas gave ground reluctantly, offering a Duma parliament with all the enthusiasm of a man handing out umbrellas during a hurricane. Then he spent the next decade trying to render it useless. But nothing exposed his failure of leadership quite like war. In 1914, Russia entered World War I. Patriotism surged, briefly. Then came the casualties. The shortages, the freezing winters without bread. Nicholas made the baffling decision to take personal command of the Russian army despite having no military experience. Meanwhile, back in the capital, his wife Alexandra assumed political control, guided by a mystic named Rasputin. Yes, that Rasputin. The optics were abysmal. The empire looked less like a state and more like a bad opera. War abroad, mysticism at home, and a Tsar still pretending the revolution outside his window was just noise. Even his children, his sweet, fragile son Alexei, suffering from hemophilia, became symbols of divine injustice and imperial detachment. The family became trapped in their own mythology. Russia burned, while Nicholas stared at the smoke, expecting it to clear. By 1917, it was over. Revolution came not with torches, but with hunger and exhaustion. Workers, soldiers, citizens, they stopped waiting. Nicholas abdicated, not with a shout, but a whimper. He was placed under house arrest, a monarch without a throne, a father without a future. A man who still believed in a divine right while the world was writing his obituary. His end, like his reign, was tragically avoidable, but it was also inevitable. He didn't rule Russia into collapse. He simply stood still while it fell around him. And yet, as passive as Nicholas seemed, his failure was monumental. He didn't need to swing a sword or issue violent edicts to earn his place on this list. Sometimes, doing nothing is the most dangerous thing a ruler can do. Still, if Nicholas was the monarch who drowned in history's tide by standing still, the next ruler waded straight into the storm armored, and unflinching ready to purge anyone who questioned her place on the throne, not despite being a woman, but because she knew no man would ever let her forget it. Zetian of China. In the long, winding corridors of Chinese imperial history full of scholar kings, warrior emperors, and philosopher bureaucrats only, one name stands out in bold, unblinking defiance of every tradition: Wu Zetian. The only woman to ever officially rule China as emperor, not just empress, consort, or dowager, but as the sovereign herself. To some, she was a necessary force of reform. To others, she was a tyrant in silken robes. Either way, she didn't ask for permission and she never said sorry. Wu began her journey in the most precarious place possible, as a concubine. Not the wife, not the queen, not even the favored mistress, just one among many ornaments in the court of Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty. And yet, she watched, she learned. She understood that power doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it trickles down in whispers, glances, and long games played over decades. When Taizong died, she was expected to retire to a Buddhist convent as was the custom. But Wu had other plans. She somehow returned to court, caught the eye of Taizong's son, Emperor Gaozong, and embedded herself again, this time with a different angle. Over time, she rose from concubine to consort to empress. Not by accident, not by luck, but by a ruthless choreography of charm, strategy, and, when necessary, elimination. Wu Zetian's ascent was not a gentle one. Rivals mysteriously disappeared. Accusations surfaced, many of them involving conveniently timed deaths, including those within her own family. One infamous tale recounts the fate of her own daughter, who died under suspicious circumstances in infancy. Wu, instead of mourning, allegedly used the tragedy to accuse the emperor's former empress of murder, thereby securing her own place beside him. Truth? Propaganda? Something in between? No one ever proved it, but after that, Wu wore the crown. When Emperor Gaozong fell ill, Wu began ruling in his place as regent, but regent wasn't enough. She declared herself emperor in 690, establishing her own dynasty, Zhou dynasty, interrupting centuries of male succession and effectively rewriting the script of Chinese politics. She wasn't content with wielding power from the sidelines. She took the throne and made sure the ink on the royal genealogy bled with her name. Once in power, Wu was both reformer and repressor. She elevated scholars, implemented merit-based promotions, expanded the civil service exam system, and supported agricultural development. She was fiercely intelligent, favoring policies that strengthened central authority and weakened aristocratic control. Under her, the empire grew in wealth and stability. But progress came wrapped in fear. Wu kept an elaborate web of secret policespies, informants, and loyal enforcers who reported every whisper of disloyalty. Suspected conspirators were exiled, tortured, executed, or erased entirely. She even created a new writing character to describe her reign untranslatable, unique, and symbolic of how thoroughly she intended to reinvent what rulership meant. She rewrote history, quite literally. In official records, rivals were defamed, edited out, or reduced to cautionary tales. Statues were built, titles granted. Her image curated with such intensity that no one could distinguish legacy from propaganda. She promoted Buddhism over Confucianism, perhaps strategically, because it gave spiritual legitimacy to a woman on the throne, something traditional Confucian scholars could barely tolerate, let alone endorse. Toward the end of her life, her grip weakened. Factions within the court began to push back. Illness crept in. She was eventually forced to abdicate in favor of her son. She died soon after, her tomb marked with an empty stone tablet. No inscription, no biography, just a blank slate, as if daring future generations to decide for themselves who she was. Some remembered her as a monster, others as a visionary, and most, quietly, as both. Wu Zetian shattered the ceiling of imperial patriarchy not with grace, but with force, and in doing so, made herself unforgettable. But if she ruled through surveillance and suppression, the next monarch didn't hide behind shadows. He declared his authority with fire, fear, and an institution so infamous that it still lives in nightmares, centuries later. Ferdinand II of Aragon. Ferdinand II of Aragon, half of one of history's most politically potent power couples, might not have seemed like a villain at first glance. He didn't scream in the streets. He didn't burn down his own palace. He wasn't prone to theatrical self-worship or public tantrums. He wore the cloak of statesmanship with ease, smiled for the portraits, and whispered diplomacy like a second language. But when the ink dried on his deals and the incense cleared from the altars, what remained was something far darker. Because Ferdinand didn't need to wear a crown of cruelty, he institutionalized it. With his wife, Isabella I of Castile, Ferdinand ruled over a newly unified Spain in the late 15th century. Together, they were called the Catholic monarchs, a title that sounded quaintly religious but masked something sharper, colder, and far more methodical. Where some rulers were tyrants by temperament, Ferdinand and Isabella were architects, careful planners of a purified nation, and by purified, they didn't mean clean, they meant Catholic. Exclusively. Their reign wasn't just a consolidation of kingdoms, it was a spiritual audit. Spain, they decided, needed to be ideologically pure, culturally uniform, and theologically uncontested. So Ferdinand looked around at the religious landscape of his kingdom, at the Jews who had lived there for centuries, at the Muslims who had ruled entire regions, at the growing undercurrent of heretical, thought and decided it was time to cleanse the ledger. Enter the Spanish Inquisition. Though technically under the Church's jurisdiction, the Inquisition in Spain functioned more like a state-run ideology enforcer. It wasn't the medieval stereotype of witch trials and haphazard mobs. No, this was bureaucracy at its bleakest. Forms, hearings, interrogations, procedural executions. Ferdinand didn't invent the Inquisition, but he expanded it, weaponized it, and wielded it with the kind of cold precision that only royal power can provide. Its targets? Mainly, conversos Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity, often under pressure, and were now suspected of practicing their old faiths in secret. Suspected was the key word. Proof wasn't necessary. Accusations were enough. If your neighbor didn't like your dinner habits or the way you whispered prayers at night, congratulations, you were now part of a legal nightmare. The Inquisition tortured not to extract information, but to extract conformity. The goal wasn't to punish sin, it was to brand it out of existence. Thousands were arrested. Many confessed, truthfully or not. Some were executed. Others had their property seized, their reputations ruined, their families disgraced. It wasn't a war. It was a slow erasure, designed not for shock but for silence. And if that weren't enough, Ferdinand and Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree in 1492. While Columbus was preparing to sail west, Spain was issuing a deadline. All Jews must convert to Christianity or leave the kingdom. Not in a few years, not after negotiations. In months, thousands fled. Some converted, others tried and failed to hide. An entire culture was forced out with little more than a suitcase and the knowledge that their homeland had turned its back on them. All of it, every interrogation, every exile, every act of sanctioned cruelty was signed off by Ferdinand. He saw it as good governance, as divine duty. His rule wasn't marked by impulsive violence, it was violence turned into policy. His cold efficiency made it all the more terrifying. And through it all, Ferdinand remained politically brilliant. He arranged marriages that shaped European dynasties. He expanded Spanish power into Italy. He played the long game with a straight face and a loaded deck. No tantrums, no chaos, just results. But if Ferdinand's tyranny was calculated and bureaucratic, His partner in power brought her own brand of pious rigor equal in force, just as precise and just as indifferent to the screams behind the church walls. Isabella I of Castile. If Ferdinand was the scalpel, Isabella was the hand guiding it, steady, devout, and convinced that every cut was a divine necessity. History often paints her in softer strokes. The noble queen who sponsored Columbus, the mother of a united Spain, the woman of iron will and moral clarity. But moral clarity can be a dangerous thing when it's defined by absolutes. To Isabella, there was only one truth, one God, one church, and she didn't mind how many people she had to remove to make sure it stayed that way. She rose to power, not by inheritance alone, but by sheer will. The throne of Castile in the 15th century wasn't waiting patiently for her. She had to take it. Through a series of political maneuvers, a strategically scandalous marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon, without the consent of the reigning king no less, and the neutralizing of rival claims, Isabella clawed her way to the top. She wasn't content to be a queen by title. She was going to rule. And rule she did. Together with Ferdinand, she transformed Spain from a fractured cluster of kingdoms into a centralized, theocratic powerhouse. But while Ferdinand handled military affairs and foreign diplomacy, Isabella's fingerprints were on the internal soul of the nation. Her mission wasn't just political unification, it was spiritual uniformity. She believed Spain could only thrive if it was one people, under one faith, speaking one language, praying to one God. And anything less was treason, not just to the crown but to heaven. Her most enduring and infamous legacy begins, as many medieval tragedies do, with a letter. In 1492, the same year she gave her blessing to Columbus's voyage west, Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree, ordering all Jews in Spain to convert to Christianity or be expelled. The logic was simple. If you weren't part of the church, you were a threat to the kingdom's moral fabric. No negotiation, no protection for centuries of shared history, just a deadline. Tens of thousands of Jews fled. Many were forced to abandon property, homes, entire lives. Others converted publicly, at least, but remained under constant suspicion. Isabella believed, or convinced herself, that this was an act of salvation, a hard medicine for a sick nation. She even consulted theologians to soothe any lingering doubts. Spoiler, she didn't have many. The fallout was enormous. Economically, culturally, socially, Spain never recovered from the loss. Generations of Jewish scholars, poets, merchants, and scientists were wiped from its intellectual landscape. But to Isabella, this wasn't a loss. It was a purge, necessary, righteous, holy. She then turned her attention south. The Reconquista, Spain's centuries-long effort to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, culminated in the siege of Granada. Isabella was there, wrapped in her pious armor, not just watching but directing. When the last Muslim kingdom in Spain fell, the surrender terms were generous on paper. Muslims could keep their religion, their customs, their mosques, but Isabella didn't like loose ends. Within a few years, those rights were eroded. Mass conversions followed. Then came another deadline. Islam, like Judaism, was quietly erased from Spanish public life. The mosque bells stopped. Church bells replaced them. And yet, to her supporters, Isabella was a saint. Literally. She was given the title Servant of God, and efforts to canonize her continue to this day. Her defenders point to her faith, her intelligence, her commitment to justice, and those things were real. But they existed alongside a cold certainty that anyone who didn't fit into her vision of Spain had no place in it. She died in 1504, deeply mourned by her court and country. But behind the hymns and processions was the silence of those no longer present, the ones exiled, erased, or extinguished by the machinery she helped design. And if Isabella and Ferdinand used religion as justification for erasure, the next king didn't even bother with theology. He simply saw the crown as a shortcut to power and cleared the path by allegedly turning family into obstacles, quite literally. Richard III of England. In the grand theatre of English monarchy, Richard III has always been cast as the villain lurking in the wing, shoulders hunched, crown tilted, dagger ready. A monarch whose name is less a chapter in history and more a warning whispered through the stone halls of royal memory. His reign was short, his methods were sharp, and his reputation? Well, it survived longer than the dynasty he tried to protect. Richard wasn't born to be king, he was born to be useful. The younger brother of King Edward IV, Richard grew up during the War of the Rosacea family squabble, elevated to civil war, where roses meant blood and cousins made terrible neighbors. The Yorks and Lancasters fought for the throne so long that by the time Richard came of age, royalty in England was less about divine right and more about who still had soldiers by Tuesday. When Edward IV died in 1483, the crown was meant for his 12-year-old son. Edward V. Richard, the boy's uncle, was named Lord Protectora babysitter with a scepter. But Richard was no passive chaperone. Within weeks, young Edward and his brother were taken to the Tower of London for protection. Parliament declared the boys illegitimate, and Richard, freshly denephewed, ascended the throne. That's when the rumors began. The princes Edward V and his younger brother Richard were never seen again. Officially, no one knows what happened. But unofficially, the world decided. Whispers turned to shouts that Richard had them murdered in the tower. Smothered, some said. Drowned in wine, said others. Or poisoned, or buried beneath the stones. Centuries later, 2 small skeletons were found in a box beneath a stairwell. That was enough for legend to close the book. To be clear, there's no smoking sword, no signed confession. But history isn't always interested in courtroom standards. Richard became the man who murdered children to steal a crown. Whether true or not, the stain never left him. But murder wasn't his only resume item. Richard's brief reign was marked by swift, often brutal consolidation of power. He passed legal reforms, some genuinely progressive, but always with a suspicious undertone. He redistributed land from nobles he didn't trust to those he did. He made enemies quickly, and his grip on the throne was always more temporary tattoo than permanent ink. Then came Henry Tudor. Henry was a Lancaster by blood and a pretender by circumstance. Exiled in France, he returned in 1485 with a modest army and a big claim. The two sides met at the Battle of Bosworth Fieldone, of those decisive showdowns that history loves because it sounds cinematic. Richard, to his credit, fought bravely. Legend says he charged into battle shouting, "A horse, a horse! My kingdom for a horse!" It's probably apocryphal, courtesy of Shakespeare, but it stuck, much like the blade that ended him. Richard was killed in the melee, unhorsed, surrounded, and struck down. His crown literally was found on a bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head. The Tudor dynasty was born. Richard's was dead in the mud. His body was buried hastily, lost for centuries, then rediscovered in a parking lot in 2012. Not a metaphor. A king found under tarmac and yellow lines. His spine was curved with scoliosis. His bones bore signs of violent death. His story still tangled in propaganda and poetry. To this day, scholars debate whether Richard was a villain, a victim, or a victim who became a villain out of necessity. Maybe he didn't order the murders. Maybe he did, and history got it right. Or maybe England, still recovering from decades of royal chaos, needed a scapegoat. But if Richard's crimes remain in shadow, the next emperor on our descent into history's darker corners made sure his brutality was in full view, returned from exile not to rebuild, but to punish, leaving trails of blood behind him and paranoia in the throne room. Emperor Justinian II of Byzantium. If emperors are meant to be wise, patient, and above all else, stable, then Justinian II was none of the above. His story doesn't read like a ruler's biography. It reads like a fever dream wrapped in vengeance, stitched together by revenge fantasies and delivered with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. He ruled the Byzantine Empire not once, but twice, and both times he left it bloodied, gasping, and thoroughly confused as to what exactly it had just survived. Justinian was born into the purple, the imperial color of the Byzantine throne, named after his famous ancestor Justinian I, the man who built the Hagia Sophia and briefly reunited Rome's shattered empire. Those were big sandals to fill, and Justinian II, he filled them with knives. He ascended to the throne in 685 CE, young, ambitious, and burning with the kind of conviction that usually gets people exiled. At first, he tried to be a reformer, raised taxes to fund the military, strengthened the army, reasserted control over the eastern provinces. In theory, all good ideas. In practice, he did it with such aggressive flair and total disregard for consensus that even his allies began nervously adjusting their togas. He wasn't subtle. He believed in absolute power. And absolute power, in Justinian's mind, came with absolute entitlement. He started arresting political opponents, confiscating land, overhauling church policy without the church's permission. His intelligence was never in doubt, but his tact was nowhere to be found. He was like a surgeon with a sword, technically precise, but deeply unsuited to the work. By 695, the people of Constantinople had had enough. His enemies staged a revolt, but this wasn't your average palace coup. No polite exile to a countryside estate, no forced retirement in silk robes. No, Justinian was captured, publicly humiliated, and brace yourself, had his nose cut off. It was symbolic. A mutilated emperor couldn't rule. It was written into law. So they shipped him off to the Crimean Peninsula, assuming that would be the last they'd hear from the noseless tyrant. Wrong. Justinian didn't die quietly. He didn't reflect. He didn't repent. He plotted, waited, smoldered. For 10 years, he wandered the edges of empire, gaining allies, building networks, and nurturing a grudge the size of the Bosporus. Then, like a character in a political thriller that's gone off the rails, he came back. In 705, with the help of a Bulgarian army and a dramatic sneak-in through an aqueductias, really he stormed Constantinople and reclaimed the throne. No negotiations, no apologies. Just blood and iron and a deeply personal vendetta. The second reign of Justinian II made the first look like a dress rehearsal. He unleashed a reign of terror on anyone who had opposed him. Mass executions, purges, torture, entire families vanished. Former allies found themselves at the wrong end of sharpened history. He didn't even pretend to govern, he ruled, like a man possessed not by power, but by memory. There was no trust left in the court. Diplomacy turned to silence. The empire began to crumble, not from foreign invasion, but from rot at its core. Justinian believed he was ordained, chosen, invincible. But paranoia doesn't make for good policy. Eventually, the fear boiled over. In 711, a new rebellion rose. This time, There was no exile. Justinian was captured while fleeing and executed along with his son. The dynasty ended where it had started, violently, suddenly, and with a sense of weary relief. Justinian II is rarely taught in school books. Too chaotic, too messy, too medieval. But in the dusty records of Byzantine politics, he looms large, a cautionary tale about power without perspective, a warning carved in marble and remembered in silence. And yet, for all his vengeance and bloodletting, Justinian was at least coherent. The next king on our descent into royal madness couldn't always claim that, because while Justinian ruled like a tyrant, this monarch ruled like a puppet with broken strings, invisible hands, and a crown that only ever made things worse. Christian VII of Denmark. History has a peculiar habit of remembering tyrants by their cruelty, their schemes, or their iron-fisted control. Christian VII of Denmark, however, is remembered not for what he did with power, but for what others did through him. A king in title, but rarely in thought, Christian's reign was the monarchy's version of leaving the lights on in an empty house. The throne wasn't occupied by a man, it was occupied by a vacancy wearing a crown. He was born into the royal house of Oldenburg in 1749, groomed like every prince with tutors, etiquette, and a sense of divine entitlement. But early on, the cracks were hard to ignore. He was nervous, erratic, and struggled to focus. Some said he was just a sensitive boy. Others whispered darker things about madness, melancholy, or a mind that never quite learned to land. By the time he took the throne at 17, Christian's behavior had already become a problem. He was prone to violent outbursts, mood swings, and what polite court doctors called severe emotional instability. Modern hindsight leans towards schizophrenia or severe mental illness, but 18th century Europe didn't have terms for that. What they had was fear, confusion, and a growing line of opportunists waiting to take control. Enter the shadow government. His court quickly divided into two types of people: those who tried to manage him and those who tried to use him. The first group tried reason, stability, and careful guidance. They failed. The second group tried manipulation, spectacle, and open ambition. They succeeded. For most of his reign, Christian was little more than a figurehead signing documents he didn't understand, giving speeches he didn't write, and being wheeled out for ceremonial appearances like a porcelain doll in royal regalia. But here's where it gets interesting. In 1768, Christian married Caroline Matilda, the sister of King George III of England. She was intelligent, thoughtful, and almost immediately aware that her new husband was not entirely present. They had one child heir secured, but little else in terms of connection. Their marriage was a performance, and Christian, increasingly lost in his own mind, wasn't reading the script. And so, in the void, someone else stepped forward. His name was Johann Friedrich Struensee, German doctor, atheist, reformer, and, for a brief moment in Danish history, the real power behind the throne. Struensee became Christian's personal physician, then his advisor, then his controller. He whispered in the king's ear, signed laws in his name, and embarked on an aggressive reform campaign. Abolishing torture, promoting freedom of the press, slashing noble privileges. Enlightenment values flooded into Denmark at breakneck speed, but they weren't coming from Christian. They were coming from a man no one had elected, working through a monarch who didn't even know what year it was. The court began to stir. Nobles fumed. And when Struensee began a rumored affair with Queen Caroline Matilda, the backlash turned from whispered gossip to open revolt. A palace coup was staged. Struensee was arrested, tried, and executed. The queen was exiled. Christian was placed under permanent supervision, technically still king, but now confined, watched, and increasingly forgotten. He lived for decades like that, fading into the wallpaper of his own court. Occasionally, he'd be wheeled out for ceremonial duties, still wearing the title, still bearing the weight of a crown he'd never truly understood. He died in 1808, his reign technically lasting over 40 years, though most of Denmark barely noticed. Christian VII is a tragic study in absence. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't cunning, he simply wasn't capable. And in his place, others moved the levers of power, sometimes for good, often for gain, always for themselves. But if Christian ruled in a daze, the next emperor ruled in full, brutal awareness, replacing constitutional failure with flamboyant horror, and leaving behind a legacy so surreal, it reads like a dictator's fever dream scripted by a horror novelist. Bokassa I of Central Africa. If monarchy is theater, then Jean Bedel Bokassa was the director, the star, and the costume department draped in silk, surrounded by bayonets and utterly detached from anything resembling reality. He didn't inherit a throne. He declared it, funded it with foreign aid, and crowned himself emperor in a ceremony that cost more than the GDP of his own country. Bokassa didn't just want to rule. He wanted to be worshipped, feared, and, if possible, dressed like Napoleon. His journey to self-made royalty began in the trenches. A military man trained by the French, Bokassa rose through the ranks of the Central African Republic's army with the cool competence of someone who knew how to follow orders and, eventually, how to ignore them. In 1966, he overthrew President David Dacko, his cousin, in a coup that was so swift and bloodless it felt almost polite. That was the last polite thing he ever did. At first, Bokassa styled himself a reformer. He promised modernization, national pride, and independence from colonial influence. But underneath the patriotic slogans was a man who treated governance like a personal vault. The national budget blurred into his bank account, opponents vanished, newspapers folded, and the presidency soon became too small for his ambitions. So in 1976, with no trace of irony, Bokassa dissolved the republic and declared the creation of the Central African Empire. He named himself Emperor Bokassa I and began planning a coronation so lavish, so obscenely out of step with his nation's poverty that even seasoned tyrants raised an eyebrow. He modeled it after Napoleon's coronation down to the last detail, except Napoleon hadn't used French aid money to pay for his golden throne. The ceremony cost an estimated $20 million, this in a country where most people lived on less than $1 a day. His robe was 32 feet long and trimmed with ermine. His crown? Encrusted with jewels, weighing nearly as much as a small child. Diplomats from the world's powers were invited, most politely declined. But Bokassa didn't care. This wasn't about diplomacy. This was about myth-making. And when the cameras turned off, the myth got darker. Bokassa ruled through fear, and not the subtle kind. He was notoriously erratic, reportedly prone to violent outbursts and irrational punishments. Dissenters were arrested without cause. Students who protested government policies like mandatory purchases of expensive school uniforms from a company tied to Bokassa were beaten, jailed, and in some cases, never seen again. The regime became a horror show draped in gold. He considered himself a father to the nation, though his paternal instincts were debatable. He had over a dozen wives and fathered more than 50 children who were paraded in state propaganda as proof of his vitality and legacy. In reality, they were part of the spectacle. Everything was. But Bokassa's empire was built on borrowed time and foreign patience. France which had supported him to keep the country within its sphere of influence, finally had enough. In 1979, while Bokassa was on a trip abroad, French troops launched Operation Barracuda, a quiet and efficient coup that reinstated the old president and exiled the emperor. Bokassa returned later, was arrested, tried for treason, murder, and other charges, and spent years in prison before being released. He died in 1996, claiming until the end that he was the 13th apostle and that he spoke directly to Jesus. Bokassa remains one of history's strangest tyrants, not because he was especially cruel, though he was, but because he seemed so determined to turn dictatorship into fantasy. He was an emperor of illusion, wrapping despotism in velvet and calling it destiny. But for all his excess, Bokassa's rule was short-lived. The next emperor ruled longer, quieter, and more ambiguously, his crimes hidden behind protocol, paper walls, and the polite fiction of constitutional monarchy, even as the world burned around him. Emperor Hirohito of Japan. When we picture tyrants, we tend to imagine loud men in military coats, shouting from balconies, clenching their fists at invisible enemies. Emperor Hirohito of Japan didn't fit that mold. He was quiet, measured, a scholar, a marine biologist, even more comfortable peering through microscopes than barking into megaphones. And yet, under his reign, Japan committed some of the most horrifying acts of the 20th century. He ruled not with a roar, but with silence, and in that silence, entire nations suffered. Hirohito was born into the chrysanthemum throne, a symbol as much as a seat. In Japanese tradition, emperors were more than rulers. They were living deities, untouchable, infallible. And during Hirohito's time, this mythology wasn't just ceremonial, it was weaponized. Every act of war, every expansionist dream, every policy of subjugation was carried out in his name, under his divine image. Whether he commanded it directly or merely allowed it to happen has long been the debate. But either way, the results were the same. In the 30s, Japan had ambition. Not the kind measured in GDP or culture exports, but the kind measured in territory. The idea of a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was born a euphemism that meant military domination of the Pacific. Under Hirohito's reign, Japan invaded Manchuria, then China, then launched full-scale war across Southeast Asia. And these weren't campaigns marked by strategy alone, they were marked by policies that dehumanized entire populations. Cities were leveled, civilians were massacred, atrocities multiplied across the map like oil spills on water. One of the most infamous examples is what history now calls the Rape of Nankinga, euphemistic title that still fails to capture the scope of what happened. In late 1937, Japanese troops entered the Chinese capital and carried out weeks of mass killing, looting, and terror against civilians. Tens of thousands died, possibly hundreds of thousands. And while official documents rarely bore Hirohito's direct order, the army operated under the imperial banner, and nothing was done to stop them. Even further from the battlefield, his government established systems of forced labor, coercing millions of Koreans, Chinese, and Southeast Asians into brutal work under wartime industry. At the same time, prisoners of war were subjected to inhumane treatment, medical experimentation, starvation, conditions so severe that even other Axis powers raised eyebrows. Throughout all of this, Hirohito remained a curious contradiction. In public, he presented as a reserved academic figura, man of science, of tradition, of ceremony, but in private, according to post-war testimonies and notes, he was regularly briefed on military operations. He signed off on battle plans. He approved strategies that, while often couched in military necessity, involved targeting civilians and endorsing scorched earth policies. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, triggering war with the United States, it did so with Hirohito's endorsement. The attack was carried out in his name. The war was prosecuted under his leadership. And when Japan began losing, when cities like Tokyo were firebombed and Hiroshima and Nagasaki were incinerated with atomic force, it was Hirohito who ultimately delivered the radio broadcast announcing surrender. His voice, never heard publicly before, broke the divine silence. It was soft, formal, and eerily detached. After the war, things got complicated. The Allied powers, particularly the United States, faced a choice: prosecute Hirohito as a war criminal or preserve him as a stabilizing symbol in post-war Japan. They chose the latter. The narrative was rewritten. Hirohito, they claimed, had been a powerless figurehead manipulated by militarists. It was convenient. It was strategic. It was, in many ways, a diplomatic myth, and it worked. He remained emperor until his death in 1989, overseeing Japan's transformation into a peaceful, modern state. But for many, particularly those in Korea, China, and Southeast Asia, his silence during the war never stopped echoing. He didn't scream, he didn't rage. He simply stood still while the machinery of imperialism rolled forward under his gaze, and that quiet complicity, for millions, was just as damning. But while Hirohito hid behind protocol and distance, the next ruler on our descent didn't bother with subtlety. He ruled with sword and fire, leading an empire built on conquest, and he never apologized for it. Mehmed IV of the Ottoman Empire. Some kings destroy their empires with vanity, others with paranoia. Mehmed IV of the Ottoman Empire did it with deer. Not metaphorically, literally. While his empire smoldered at the edges and rebellions brewed in the heartlands, Mehmed was busy with his favorite pastime: hunting. Not strategy, not diplomacy, not reform, hunting, and lots of it. He was known as Avcı Mehmed the Hunter, and that nickname wasn't symbolic. He turned the forests of Thrace into his personal court, building lodges, planning grand expeditions, and disappearing from Constantinople for weeks at a time. One could say he led an empire the way some people maintain fish tanks technically, but mostly through delegation. Born in 1642, Mehmed became sultan at the age of 6, which, to be fair, is a ridiculous age to inherit an empire. At 6, most children are learning to read. Mehmed was learning how to rule over 3 continents and the most powerful Islamic caliphate in the world. Naturally, others ruled in his name, first his mother, Turhan Sultan, and then a carousel of viziers, advisors, and opportunists. The Ottoman court had long been a place of intrigue, but under a child sultan, it turned into a buffet of ambition. But Mehmed didn't resist the puppet strings. He didn't want the throne. He wanted the forest. As he aged, he grew more interested in game trails than trade routes. For most of his adult life, he left governance in the hands of his grand viziers, particularly Köprülü Mehmed Pasha and his son, Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed Pasha. The Köprülüs were brilliant, brutal administrators. They restructured the government, crushed corruption, and led military campaigns with a level of efficiency that gave the empire a brief second wind. This accidental golden age had nothing to do with Mehmed himself. He signed the decrees. He nodded at the victories. But his main contribution to governance was staying out of the way until, inevitably, he didn't. Because the thing about leaving others to rule for you is that, eventually, you forget how. And when those competent hands die or retire, you're left with a crown, a crumbling empire, and no idea what to do with either. In the later years of his reign, Mehmed IV's disinterest morphed into incompetence. Without strong viziers, the empire's seams began to split. Revolts erupted in Anatolia. Janissaries, the elite corps of Ottoman soldiers, grew restless and mutinous. Corruption crept back in, infecting the bureaucracy like dry rot behind painted walls. And Mehmed? He responded by hosting bigger hunts. Then came the catastrophe. In 1683, the Ottomans marched on Vienna again. This was supposed to be the triumphant return to European dominance. But unlike earlier campaigns, this one was a logistical nightmare. The army was overextended, poorly supplied, and facing a coalition of European forces that finally decided to put aside their differences and push back. The siege of Vienna collapsed spectacularly. The Ottomans retreated in chaos, and suddenly, the aura of Ottoman invincibility was gone. The defeat wasn't just military, it was psychological. Across Europe, pamphlets proclaimed the end of Ottoman dominance. Inside the empire, dissent spread like wildfire. Confidence in the Sultan vanished, and in 1687, the Janissaries revolted. Not a riot, a full-blown mutiny. They marched into Constantinople, dragged Mehmed from his throne, and deposed him. He was sent into forced retirement lists, a political exile and more a historical footnote. He died a few years later, quietly and forgotten, in Edirne. Mehmed IV ruled for nearly 4 decades, one of the longest reigns in Ottoman history. But length isn't legacy. His name doesn't evoke law codes or architectural wonders. It evokes loss of power, of direction, of potential. He inherited a world empire and left behind a shrinking shadow. And while Mehmed escaped the guillotine, the next king wasn't so lucky. Born into inbreeding, crowned by default, and cursed by incompetence, he would steer his empire straight into the mouth of collapse barely able to speak, much less rule. Charles II of Spain. If you were to take all the dysfunction, decay, and dynastic desperation of the Habsburg monarchy and distill it into a single person, that person would be Charles II of Spain. He wasn't a tyrant in the traditional sense. He didn't order purges or march armies across continents. But his reign is still remembered as one of the most painful slow-motion implosions in royal history. Tragic final act where the crown sat not on the head of a king, but on the shoulders of a broken bloodline. Charles was born in 1661, the only surviving son of King Philip IV and his niece Mariana of Austria. Yes, niece. Because the Spanish Habsburgs, desperate to keep their royal bloodlines pure, had been practicing royal inbreeding like it was a family tradition. The family tree no longer branched, it folded. Charles was the inevitable result. From birth, his health was a disaster. He had trouble walking, talking, even swallowing. His jaw was so pronounced and misshapen thanks to generations of intermarriage that he could barely chew food. He suffered frequent illnesses, seizures, and what polite historians call developmental delays. Many wondered if he would live to adulthood. Fewer wondered whether he should ever rule. But rule he did, sort of. He became king at the age of 4 after his father's death. His mother, Mariana, became regent and ruled in his name for years. As Charles grew older, it became clear that he was not equipped physically, mentally, or emotionally to govern an empire. But in the strange logic of monarchy, it didn't matter. He was the king. That title was sacrosanct, and so Spain pressed on with a sovereign who could barely sign his name. The court became a theater of denial. Ministers made decisions in Charles's name. His mother wielded immense power behind the curtain. Advisors manipulated his isolation, convinced that public visibility would only spark further ridicule and unrest. Charles was rarely seen in public without a carefully controlled entourage. He was more symbol than sovereign, an emblem of royal continuity, even as the foundation beneath him crumbled. And crumble it did. By the time Charles reached adulthood, such as it was, Spain was no longer the golden empire of conquest and prestige. Its economy was collapsing, its military was outdated, its colonies were restless. The royal treasury was a collection of IOUs, inflation ran wild, agriculture declined, and famine visited more than once. But perhaps the most destabilizing issue was the one that hung over the court like a funeral shroud: succession. Charles had no children. He married twice, once to a French princess, once to a Bavarian one, but produced no heir. Whispers turned to rumors, rumors turned to desperation. Was he infertile, cursed, bewitched? Yes, bewitched was a serious theory. Many believed he had been hexed, and royal exorcists were brought in to cleanse the king. They tried prayers, rituals, even holy relics. Nothing worked. As his health declined, European powers began circling like vultures. Who would inherit Spain? France? Austria? The looming question triggered decades of diplomatic anxiety, alliances, and eventually war. When Charles finally died in 1700 at the age of 38, the War of the Spanish Succession erupted almost immediately, pitting major European powers against each other in a multi-year brawl over his empty throne. Charles II left behind no heir, no reforms, no great works, just an empire gasping for breath and a Europe on the brink. His body was reportedly so wasted at death that it horrified the royal physicians. His brain, one wrote, was full of water. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. He was a king who never ruled, a symbol of a dynasty that had run out of time, and while Charles is often remembered with pity, his reign was far from harmless. In his absence of strength, others prayed, others failed, and Spain suffered. But at least Charles's ineptitude was involuntary. The next ruler chose violence with purpose. He waged war not only to expand his borders, but to silence faiths, rewrite cultures, and crush dissent in the name of God and empire with fire, steel, and a chilling sense of order. Shaka Zulu. Some rulers build nations. Shaka Zulu forged one through force, fear, and a vision so unrelenting that it changed the entire map of southern Africa. He didn't inherit a throne. He seized it, shaped it, and then shattered anything that didn't align with his idea of power. But where others ruled to expand territory, Shaka ruled to remake identity. Nationhood, to him, wasn't a matter of borders. It was blood, discipline, and absolute control. Born around 1787 to an outcast union between a Zulu prince and a common woman, Shaka was ostracized from the start. His early life was humiliation disguised as upbringing, mocked, rejected, and driven into exile. But if adversity builds character, Shaka's character was carved from iron. He entered military service under a neighboring chiefdom and quickly rose through the ranks, not because he was charismatic, but because he was terrifyingly competent. Eventually, he returned to the Zulu, a relatively small tribe among many in the patchwork of Nguni peoples. What happened next was less a rise and more a transformation. Within a few years, Shaka had restructured the Zulu into a hyper-disciplined military machine. Gone were the loose tribal norms of honor-based skirmishes. In their place, formations, regiments, and relentless drills. Shaka turned tribal warriors into something new, something the region had never seen before. His innovations weren't limited to tactics. He redesigned weapons, replacing the traditional throwing spear with the Aikal-Wa short stabbing spear named for the sound it made entering and exiting a body. Shields were standardized. Formations like the bullhorn encircled enemies with calculated precision. His army didn't just fight, it performed. It was coordinated terror with a marching beat. But Shaka wasn't building an army. He was building a state. He demanded total loyalty not just in battle, but in culture, language, and allegiance. Those who joined the Zulu were absorbed. Those who resisted were erased. Entire tribes were swept aside, assimilated, or annihilated in a wave of expansion so massive it became known as the Mfeken, or the Crushing. Millions were displaced. Some were killed in battle, others fled, their communities shattered. The Mfekene wasn't just war. It was migration on a tectonic scale. Tribes were pushed from ancestral lands, reshaped into militarized refugees, or scattered entirely. New kingdoms rose from the chaos. Old ones vanished. The political map of southern Africa was redrawn with Shaka at its center an emperor in everything but name. And through it all, he ruled with obsessive control. Shaka demanded celibacy from his warriors, believing sexual relationships distracted from loyalty. He banned marriage among his soldiers. He monitored dissent like it was a military drill. Punishments were swift, brutal, and often public. Executions were not rare. They were routine. Yet even tyrants mourn. In 1827, his mother, Nandahi's closest companion and emotional anchor deed. Shaka's response was apocalyptic. He declared a year of mourning. No crops were to be planted. No milk was to be consumed. Pregnancies were outlawed. Any woman found pregnant was executed, along with her husband. It was mourning as policy, and grief as national trauma. Thousands died in this strange ritualized collapse of civil life. Some say it broke him, others say it revealed him. His final years were marked by paranoia and increasing instability. He trusted fewer and fewer people. His cruelty intensified. And eventually, in 1828, 3 of his own half-brothers assassinated him. They stabbed him to death and buried him in an unmarked grave. No monument, no legacy carved in stone. Just silence. But Shaka's impact didn't die with him. The Zulu kingdom endured. The militarized structure he built influenced generations. His rise from exile to king remains one of history's most improbable and most unsettling success stories. Yet even Shaka's brand of conquest had limits. The next ruler on our path didn't just expand an empire. He buried its soul under orthodoxy, ruled in the name of divine authority, and crushed every rebellion with such ruthless intensity that even centuries later, his name is spoken with unease. Aurangzeb of the Mughal Empire. If the Mughal Empire were a painting, it would begin in gold and end in ash. Aurangzeb, the 6th emperor of the dynasty, was the man who watched the colors drain and called it piety. His reign was the longest in Mughal history, 49 years of warfare, orthodoxy, expansion, and systematic unraveling. Under his rule, the empire reached its territorial peak. And yet, with every conquest, it hollowed out from the inside. It's a strange legacy, to be remembered as both the preserver and the undoer of an empire. But Aurangzeb didn't believe in legacy. He believed in God. Born in 1618, Aurangzeb was the son of Shah Jahan the Emperor, who built the Taj Mahal, a monument to love. Aurangzeb had no interest in love stories. He was austere, devout, and deadly serious. While his brothers reveled in poetry and palaces, Aurangzeb studied the Quran and military strategy. He saw indulgence as weakness, pleasure as sin. The empire, to him, was not a playground of silk and art, it was a battlefield for righteousness. When Shah Jahan fell ill, a war of succession erupted between his sons. Aurangzeb emerged victorious not just through strategy, but through ruthless calculation. He defeated and executed his brothers, imprisoned his father, and claimed the throne. It wasn't a quiet transition. It was a blood-stained coronation wrapped in scripture, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Aurangzeb styled himself as a warrior of the faith. He banned court music, destroyed royal paintings, and reimposed Islamic taxes that his predecessors had abolished. While earlier Mughal rulers, especially Akbar, had promoted religious tolerance and embraced India's diversity, Aurangzeb did not. He saw pluralism as a deviation from divine law. Temples were demolished, especially in rebellious regions. Non-Muslims faced new taxes and restrictions. Some converted under pressure, others resisted and paid dearly. But this wasn't simply personal prejudice, it was policy. Aurangzeb believed he was restoring purity to an empire that had wandered too far into syncretism. He viewed himself not just as a king, but as a servant of divine order. His court was a fortress of Islamic orthodoxy. Scholars were favored, mystics were sidelined, architecture turned from flourished elegance to fortified severity. Gone was the gentle fusion of Hindu and Muslim aesthetics. In its place, domes of cold symmetry and calligraphic absolutism. And while he tightened ideological control, he never stopped waging war. Almost every year of his reign was spent in some form of military campaign. He expanded the empire southward, conquering vast territories in the Deccan. But expansion came at a cost. The treasury bled. The military stretched thin. Local revolts multiplied. The Marathas, in particular by the formidable Shivaji and his successors, became thorns that grew into daggers. Aurangzeb's army could occupy cities but not tame them. As the years dragged on, so did the wars. What began as triumphant conquest descended into endless siege. Aurangzeb, once a sharp tactician, became an aging general moving pieces on a board that no longer obeyed the rules. He ruled longer than any Mughal before him, but the empire he left behind was brittle. The bureaucracy was paralyzed, the nobility resentful, the people exhausted. He died in 1707 at the age of 88, buried in a simple, unmarked grave in Maharashtra, according to his own instructions. No marble mausoleum, no towering tomb, just dirt, stone, and silence. Some see that grave as humility, others see it as irony. After decades of building an empire on the backs of his subjects, he asked for simplicity in death, but it was too late. The simplicity he demanded for himself had already been imposed on millions during his reign. Aurangzeb's fall didn't happen in one moment. It happened slowly, through erosion, repression, and the extinguishing of the empire's old light. The Mughal dynasty would limp on for another century, but it was already dying when he closed his eyes. And if Aurangzeb extinguished a golden age with theological fire, the next monarch on our descent ruled not with ideology, but with incompetence, taxing his people into revolt, alienating his barons, and leaving such a legacy of failure that history had no choice but to rewrite the rules of monarchy entirely. King John of England. If you were to design a medieval king using only the ingredients people despise: greed, cowardice, treachery, failure, you'd end up with King John of England. Even among the long, scandalous scroll of English monarchs, John holds a special place, not for military triumphs or grand speeches, but for being so consistently awful that his own nobles essentially staged a workplace intervention and made him sign a document limiting his power. That document, the Magna Carta. So yes, one of the most foundational moments in the history of constitutional government exists because King John was that bad. He was born in 1166, the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. His older brothers, especially Richard the Lionheart, got the glamour, crusades, chivalry, songs written about them. John, on the other hand, got left behind. His father nicknamed him Lackland because, as the baby of the family, he was left with no inheritance. That stung, and John never quite got over it. When he did become king in 1199, after Richard's death, it wasn't through valor. It was through process of elimination. The charismatic crusader was gone. The competent heirs were dead. And John, the spare part, finally had the spotlight. What followed was less a reign and more a prolonged, angry shrug. John's rule began with failure and rarely strayed from the theme. His first major act as king was to lose most of England's lands in France. Normandy, Anjou, Ménil, gone. Not because he lacked armies, but because he lacked diplomacy, patience, and the ability to stop alienating everyone who could help him. His military campaigns were poorly planned and even more poorly led. Even his allies found him exhausting. But where he truly excelled, his one royal specialty was extortion. Needing money to fund his endless wars and bribe fleeting alliances, John turned England into a fiscal torture chamber. Taxes weren't just high, they were unpredictable, punitive, and laced with personal vendetta. He extorted nobles for fines, demanded ransoms for hostages he had no intention of releasing, and sold justice to the highest bidder. If you wanted your rights, you paid. If you didn't pay, you lost your rights, or your land, or your peace. Even the church wasn't safe. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died, John rejected the Pope's chosen successor and tried to install his own candidate. Pope Innocent III retaliated by placing all of England under interdict, meaning no sacraments, no church services, no official burials. The entire country was spiritually frozen. John responded by confiscating church property and pocketing the profits. Eventually, under threat of excommunication and international invasion, John gave in, publicly surrendering the kingdom to the Pope and then receiving it back as a vassal. He basically pawned the crown for papal protection. By 1215, the barons had had enough. They marched on London, forcing John to negotiate. The result was the Magna Carta, a revolutionary document that said, in essence, you can't just do whatever you want. It guaranteed basic feudal rights, limited royal abuse, and set the foundation for future legal systems. John, of course, signed it, smiled, and immediately tried to have it annulled. Civil war followed. Rebellion swept the kingdom. Some barons even invited the French prince to come take the throne. That's how bad things had gotten. English nobles would rather have a foreign ruler than keep dealing with John. He died in 1216 in the middle of the civil war he created. Some say it was dysentery. Others blame a surfeit of peaches. Either way, he left behind a shattered kingdom, a traumatized nobility, and a son Henry III who would spend much of his reign cleaning up the wreckage. King John never had a statue in Westminster. No glowing epitaph. No heroic ballads. Just a reputation. Cowardly, cruel, and catastrophically bad at being king. But at least John had the excuse of incompetence. The next emperor had vision, precision, and an iron grip so unyielding that he tried to reshape reality itself, burning books, burying scholars, and building his immortality one forced death at a time. Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China. In the long and winding saga of Chinese emperors, none loom quite as larger, quite as unsettling as Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. He wasn't born with a crown. He carved it out of chaos, With cunning, paranoia, and a massive appetite for permanence, he took a fractured land of feuding kingdoms and welded it into a single empire. Then he ruled it with such iron precision that even centuries later, the ground still seems to shudder beneath his tomb. Born as Yingzheng in 259 BCE, he ascended to the throne of the Qin state at just 13 years old. Back then, China wasn't one country. It was a patchwork of squabbling warlords, kingdoms and dynasties clawing at each other like cats in a sack. Zheng didn't want to play defense. He wanted to end the game. By the time he was 38, he had done it. Through brilliant military strategy and brutal suppression, he conquered the 6 rival states and declared himself not just king, but something new, Qin Shi Huang, meaning first emperor, not a king of a region, not a warlord among many, but the emperor of everything, of China, of history, of eternity. And from the moment he unified the country, he became obsessed with keeping it that way forever. He launched sweeping reforms to bind the vast new empire together. He standardized currency, weights and measures, legal codes, even the width of cart axles so they could travel more efficiently on roads he ordered paved across the land. He mandated a single written script. For the first time, Chinese people from distant provinces could read the same texts, obey the same laws, and trade in the same coins. But for all his visionary accomplishments, Qin Shi Huang's empire building came with a price, and it wasn't paid in gold. He ruled with legalism, a philosophy that prioritized law and order over virtue or tradition. Mercy was weakness. Rule breakers weren't lectured, they were erased. The legal system under his rule was rigid and unforgiving. Even minor offenses could be met with public execution or mutilation. And criticism of the state, that wasn't just discouraged, it was obliterated. In 213 BCE, he ordered the burning of the books. Thousands of texts on poetry, philosophy, and history, particularly Confucian works, were destroyed. Why? Because independent thought was a threat. Because questioning the past meant questioning the present. Because Qin didn't want comparisons, he wanted control. The following year, in 212 BCE, he buried hundreds of scholars alive. Confucian intellectuals who had dared to criticize his rule or resist the destruction of knowledge were condemned en masse. It wasn't enough to erase their ideas, he erased the thinkers themselves. Quietly, efficiently. And then came the construction. Qin Shi Huang launched colossal building projects that changed the landscape of China. He mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them prisoners and peasants, pressed into forced labor to connect and expand defensive walls built by previous kingdoms. These became the foundation of what would later be known as the Great Wall of China. It wasn't a wall of glory in his time, it was a graveyard of effort built by hands that never stopped bleeding. But even with his empire under control, Qin couldn't sleep. Not because of enemies, but because of death. He became obsessed with immortality. He sent expeditions in search of mythical elixirs, hired alchemists who promised eternal life and delivered nothing but mercury-laced potions. Ironically, the very concoctions meant to preserve him may have hastened his end. Yet in death, his ambition only grew. Beneath a hill in modern-day Xi'an lies his unfinished afterlife project, a tomb complex so vast it's still being excavated today. Most famously, it includes the terracotta army thousands of life-size soldiers, horses, chariots, all buried to protect him in the next world. No two faces are the same. A silent legion crafted by artisans who likely never left the tomb alive. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE, alone and possibly poisoned by his own pursuit of immortality. His dynasty collapsed just a few years later, but his legacy, it refused to die. He united a nation. He built a wall. He silenced generations. He tried to become a Godin, ended up becoming a cautionary tale carved in stone and buried in legend. But if Qin tried to erase opposition with walls and flame, the next ruler tried to erase belief, itself marching into temples, outlawing faith, and desecrating sacred rites in a bid to control not just people's bodies, but their souls. Antiochus IV, Epiphanes of the Seleucid Empire. Most tyrants seek to rule over people. Antiochus IV, Epiphanes sought to rule over thought. To him, loyalty wasn't enough. He wanted agreement, worship, not just of himself, but of a carefully orchestrated worldview where his gods were the only gods, and his empire's culture was the only culture. Resistance wasn't just rebellion, it was blasphemy. And Antiochus responded to blasphemy with fire and steel. He came to power in 175 BCE as ruler of the Seleucid Empire, a Hellenistic kingdom born from the fragments of Alexander the Great's conquests. By the time Antiochus arrived, the Seleucid state was already a puzzle of fractious regions, rival beliefs, and bubbling unrest. It wasn't the kind of empire you ruled by charm. It required force, and Antiochus had plenty to offer. His self-given title, Epiphanes, meant God manifest, not metaphorically, literally. Antiochus saw himself as a living embodiment of divinity equal parts king and icon. He filled his cities with statues, stamped his name into prayers, and styled himself as the new Zeus. To his supporters, this was inspirational. To his enemies, and there were many, it was madness with a golden laurel crown. What made Antiochus especially dangerous wasn't just his ego, it was his missionary zeal. He didn't just want obedience, he wanted everyone in his empire to live like Greeks, dress like Greeks, pray like Greeks, speak Greek, think Greek. For much of the empire, this pressure to assimilate, known as Hellenization, was already creeping in. But under Antiochus, it became mandatory. Nowhere did his project meet more resistance than in Judea. The Jewish population there, governed by their own laws, customs, and a deep-rooted monotheism, posed a challenge to Antiochus's ambitions. They didn't just reject idol worship, they prohibited it. They didn't just prefer their traditions, they saw them as divine law, which made them, in Antiochus's eyes, a problem. At first, he tried political manipulation. He installed a high priest of his choosing in the Jerusalem Temple man, more loyal to the Seleucid treasury than to Torah. But when that failed to pacify the region, Antiochus dropped the pretense of diplomacy. In 167 BCE, he launched a full-scale cultural assault. The temple in Jerusalem, Judaism's most sacred site, was desecrated. Its holy artifacts removed. A statue of Zeus erected inside. Pagan sacrifices performed on the altar. Jewish practices were outlawed. Observing the Sabbath, circumcising one's children, studying scriptural, punishable by death, scrolls were burned, teachers executed. Faith in Antiochus's empire had become a criminal act. His strategy wasn't just repression, it was humiliation. Jewish communities were forced to eat pork in public rituals. Entire villages were turned into stages for forced apostasy. Antiochus believed he could erase an identity by destroying its rituals. What he underestimated was what happened when people have nothing left to lose. The result was revolt. A priest named Mattathias, along with his sons most famously Judah Maccabees, sparked a guerrilla rebellion. What began as a desperate resistance turned into the Maccabean revolt, a protracted and bloody uprising that shocked the Seleucids with its resilience. Antiochus, occupied with other military campaigns and the illusion of control, failed to contain it. By 164 BCE, his health began to deteriorate. Ancient sources describe an illness that overtook him rapidly, painful, humiliating, and accompanied by hallucinations. Whether it was divine retribution or just disease, his empire watched as the man who claimed to be a god crumbled into something frail and very, very human. He died that same year. The revolt continued without him, and eventually the Jewish rebels reclaimed the temple, rededicated it, and established the Hasmonean dynasty. The holiday of Hanukkah commemorates that restoration not just of a building, but of a belief system Antiochus had tried to extinguish. His empire limped on for a time, but his legacy never recovered. Antiochus Epiphanes became a symbol not of divinity, but of desecration. A warning carved in scripture and memory that no ruler, no matter how gilded his throne or loud his decrees, can extinguish a culture simply by outlawing it. But where Antiochus desecrated faith to enforce control, the next emperor corrupted the very machinery of governance, it's turning a powerful empire into a paranoid mirror palace where every whisper could be your last. And even senators learned to smile while digging their own graves. Domitian of Rome. If paranoia were a governing style, Domitian was its patron saint. He didn't build an empire, he inherited one. But what he built within it was something darker. A throne surrounded by mirrors, spies, and shadows. He ruled Rome for 15 years, and in that time turned it into a paranoid theater where loyalty was suspect, flattery was currency, and silence was survival. Born in 51 CE, the youngest son of Vespasian, Domitian wasn't exactly Rome's favorite son. His father and older brother Titus were military heroes builders, generals, men of glory. Domitian was the afterthought, the paperclip at the bottom of the imperial drawer. But fate and the short reign of his brother handed him the purple robe in 81 CE. And once it was on his shoulders, Domitian didn't just wear it, he wrapped it tightly. At first, he seemed promising. He stabilized the economy, raised soldiers' pay, and launched building projects across the empire. He even cared about justice, at least on paper. But that early promise soon morphed into something else. Control, order, obsession. He believed himself to be divinely appointed, referring to himself as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. And while the Senate grumbled behind closed doors, they also nodded and bowed. Because disagreement under Domitian didn't just end careers, it ended lives. He filled the imperial court with informants, spies disguised as servants, courtiers encouraged to report each other, senators executed on the strength of a whisper, trials became formalities, confessions were extracted under torture. Reputations vanished overnight, and Domitian watched it all with cold calculation. He didn't need the people to love him. He needed them to obey. This wasn't madness, it was design. Domitian believed Rome had grown soft, too decadent, too disorderly. So he cast himself as a moral reformer. He censored books, banned public performances he found indecent, enforced traditional Roman values with the edge of a sword. Adultery became a capital crime again. Never mind that Domitian himself was known for indulging freely outside his marriage. Hypocrisy, in his mind, wasn't a flaw. It was privilege. He launched military campaigns, especially in Germania, and proclaimed them as grand victories, though most were tactical retreats or diplomatic draws. Monuments were erected, coins minted, poets commissioned to sing his praises. Propaganda was his love language, but beneath the marble and verse was a ruler deeply insecure, surrounded by a court that smiled too widely and spoke too little. Even those closest to him were not safe. Domitian exiled and executed numerous family members. His cousin Flavius Sabinus was killed. His niece Julia, rumored to have had an affair with him, died mysteriously. The details were always vague, the motives never clear. His reign became a blur of funerals, decrees, and disappearances. By the late 80s CE, fear was the air Rome breathed. The Senate functioned more like a hostage situation than a governing body, and then, inevitably, someone snapped. In 96 CE, a palace conspiracy finally reached him. His own servants, likely with the silent blessing of high-ranking officials, assassinated him in his private chambers. Not in a public revolt, not on the battlefield, but quietly, surgically. Rome didn't erupt in mourning. The Senate convened within hours to damn his memory literally. Damnatio memoriae, the Roman practice of erasing someone from history, was declared. Statues were torn down, names chiseled off monuments, coins melted. He was to be forgotten, as though he'd never ruled at all. But history isn't so obedient. Domitian remains a symbol of the authoritarian drift, the ease with which a powerful state can be hollowed out by fear, surveillance, and show trials. He ruled not as a man, but as a mirror reflecting Rome's greatness while quietly erasing its soul. And if Domitian made senators tremble with silence, the next king made his own family vanish with a quiet box and a lock. A ruler not remembered for conquest or cruelty on the battlefield, but for the cold, suffocating horror he inflicted behind palace door sown rice grain at a time. King Yongjo of Joseon, Korea. Some monarchs write their cruelty in blood, others carve it into stone. King Yongjo of Joseon, Korea etched his legacy into something far more fragile family. His reign, one of the longest in Korean history, was outwardly marked by reform, longevity, and Confucian order. But behind the official records and the stoic portraits lies one of the most unsettling royal tragedies ever committed in silence. A king who ruled with discipline, reason, and meticulous balance until his own son threatened to tip the scale. Yongjo ascended to the throne in 1724, following the sudden death of his half-brother, King Yongjong. Even his rise was shadowed by controversy. Rumors circulated that Yongjo had hastened his brother's demise. Poison was whispered, though never proven. Whether or not it was true, the suspicion clung to him like smoke. From the beginning, Yongjo ruled with one eye over his shoulder. Yet in many ways, he was a model monarch. He was highly educated, serious about statecraft, and determined to restore the stability of the Joseon court. The dynasty had been plagued by factional infighting between conservative Confucian groups, so Yongjo attempted to bridge the divides with a policy called Tangpyeongchik, or policy of impartiality. It was ambitious, noble, and, like most idealistic policies, impossible to enforce without stepping on some powerful toes. Still, Yongjo tried. He reformed the tax system, invested in public granaries, and made efforts to curb corruption. He reigned for 52 years, a reign marked by careful deliberation, long council meetings, and endless notes in the margins of palace records. He was obsessed with propriety, with duty, with being the kind of ruler history wouldn't be able to criticize. But beneath all that order, there was a tremor he couldn't control. His son, Crown Prince Sado, was the answer to Yongjo's succession problem. A bright child at first, groomed with the weight of future rule pressing into his every lesson. But as Sado grew, something shifted. He became erratic, emotional, unpredictable. His behavior at court turned from awkward to alarming. He reportedly suffered from violent outbursts, sudden panic, and disturbing compulsions. Modern psychologists speculate bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or trauma-induced psychosis, but in the 18th century Joseon court, there was only one diagnosis: unfit. Yongzhou watched his heir fall apart under the weight of expectation, and rather than stepping in with compassion or flexibility, he doubled down on discipline. Sado was scolded publicly, humiliated, denied basic trust. The court became a pressure cooker, and Sado-isolated, desperate, cornered, began lashing out. Servants reported assaults, alleged murders. Rumors mounted that the crown prince had become a danger not just to the court, but to the very future of the kingdom. In 1762, the king made a decision. But here's the thing. Kings didn't just execute crown princes. It was politically disastrous. It invited rebellion, divine punishment, cosmic imbalance in the Confucian universe. Yongzhou, ever the legalist, found a workaround. He summoned Sado to the palace, and there, beneath the stone eaves of Changdeokgung, the order was given out with a sword, but with a rice chest. Sado was forced inside a wooden box used to store grain. The lid was sealed. No one was to open it. He died after 8 days alone, thirsty, suffocating, and just 27 years old. The act horrified the court, but no one dared protest. Yongzhou claimed that Sado had gone mad, that he had no choice, that the kingdom had to be protected. He even posthumously granted Sado the title of king, as if a ceremonial balm could soothe a festering wound. And yet, the wound stayed. The tragedy left scars across generations. Sado's son, King Zhongzhou, would grow up haunted by his father's fate, carrying both the trauma and the throne. Korea never forgot the rice chest. It became more than an execution. It became a symbol of filial piety turned fatal, of Confucian duty pushed to its cruelest extreme. Yongzhou died in 1776, having preserved his dynasty but shattered his legacy. For all his reforms, wisdom, and longevity, he is most remembered for the box he sealed and the silence that followed. But while Yongzhou ruled behind palace gates, battling a son he couldn't save, the next monarch's war would spill into the streets, the parliaments, and the battlefields, until a nation rose up and said, "Enough." And this time, it wouldn't end with exile. It would end with a royal head on the block. King Charles I of England. When a king loses his head, literally, something has gone very, very wrong. Charles I of England was not the first monarch to anger his people, nor the last to misjudge his power. But he holds the singular distinction of being tried, sentenced, and executed by his own subjects, by his own government, and not in a quiet palace coup or a whispered poisoning. This was done in public, by axe, in full view of history, with a crowd so stunned it reportedly gasped in silence. How does a man with a crown end up on the chopping block? Charles was born in 1600, the second son of King James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England. He wasn't expected to rule. But when his older brother died, the spotlight turned, and Charles, shy, stiff, deeply religious, stepped onto the stage. He ascended the throne in 1625 with all the divine pomp expected of a monarch. Unfortunately, Charles didn't just believe in the divine right of kings, he practiced it with alarming intensity. To Charles, kings weren't negotiators. They were appointed by God. Parliament, laws, popular opinion, these were inconveniences at best, threats at worst. He believed in hierarchy, ceremony, authority, and he expected everyone else to believe in it too. Parliament did not. From the beginning, Charles's reign was rocky. He clashed with Parliament over money, war, and religion. Parliament wanted oversight, accountability, checks, and balances. Charles wanted revenue and silence. When he couldn't get what he wanted through debate, He dissolved Parliament. Then he did it again and again. Eventually, he ruled for 11 years without theme a period known, with rich irony, as the personal rule. Critics preferred another name, the 11 Years' Tyranny. During that time, Charles imposed taxes without consent, censored the press, and used the courts to punish dissenters. But his greatest undoing wasn't financial, it was spiritual. He imposed religious reforms that leaned heavily toward high Anglicanist pomp, ritual, and hierarchy, which to many Protestants smelled suspiciously like Catholicism. In a post-Reformation England still haunted by the specter of popery, this was not a light accusation. His imposition of a new prayer book on Scotland triggered full-blown rebellion. The bishop's wars drained his coffers and forced him to do the unthinkable, recall Parliament in 1640. Once back, Parliament didn't just want to discuss budgets, they wanted reform, and Charles, ever the absolutist, pushed back. What followed was a slow-motion civil war dressed in wigs and velvet. In 1642, war broke out between royalists, supporters of the king, and parliamentarians, supporters of, well, not being ruled like property. England fractured, families split, towns burned. What began as a political feud turned into a national tragedy. And through it all, Charles remained the same unbending, unwavering, tragically consistent. Even after his defeat in the First English Civil War, Charles continued to scheme. He negotiated in bad faith, tried to rally support from Scotland, and reignited conflict. The Second Civil War followed. More deaths, more division. Eventually, Parliament, now backed by Oliver Cromwell and the new model army, had enough. In 1649, Charles was put on trial for high treason. It was unprecedented. Kings weren't supposed to stand in the dock like common criminals. They were supposed to be anointed, untouchable. But there he stood, refusing to recognize the court, wrapped in dignity, arrogance, and a sense of divine injustice. He was found guilty. On the 30th of January, 1649, Charles I was led onto a scaffold in front of the banqueting house in Whitehall. He wore 2 shirts so he wouldn't shiver in the cold and appear afraid. He gave a short speech. Then he laid his head on the block. With one swing of the axe, the monarchy was decapitated. England became a republic for the first and only time in its history. Charles left behind a legacy of principle turned to folly. He believed in kingship so deeply, he was willing to die for it. Unfortunately, his people were willing to kill for it. But while Charles clung to sacred order, the next ruler will abandon it completely, ushering in a reign so flamboyant, chaotic, and scandalous that even the Roman Empire, in all its decadence, took a step back and said, "That's a bit much." Emperor Elagabalus of Rome. Some emperors are remembered for conquest, others for law. Elagabalus, ruler of Rome from 218 to 222 CEs, remembered for chaos and eyeliner. His reign wasn't just a deviation from the imperial norm, it was a full-speed detour into decadence, religious frenzy, and royal absurdity. Historians still argue where the line lies between scandal and smear, but one thing is clear. Elagabalus ruled Rome like it was a costume party, and he was both the host and the entertainment. Born as Varius Avitus Bassianus, he was never meant to rule anything more powerful than a local shrine. But in a classic Roman plot twist, power came calling. His mother, Julia Soaemias, was a sharp-eyed political operative from the powerful Severan dynasty. After the assassination of the Emperor Caracalla and a brief puppet reigned by Macrinus, she launched a full-scale PR war. She declared that young Elagabalus, then only 14, was the secret son of Caracalla and thus rightful heir to the throne. Coins were minted, legions bribed. And just like that, The teenage high priest from Syria became emperor of Rome. From the start, Elagabalus had different ideas about what it meant to rule. Instead of embracing Roman tradition, he tried to force the empire to embrace his. His devotion was not to Jupiter or Mars, but to Elagabal, the Syrian sun god after whom he took his imperial name. Elagabalus imported the black meteorite that represented the deity into Rome, built a temple called the Elagabalium, and tried to position his god above all Roman deities. Not metaphorically, he literally tried to fuse Elagabal with Jupiter, hoping the Senate would sign off on rewriting the entire Roman pantheon. The Senate was not enthusiastic. But it wasn't just theology that made them sweat. It was everything else. Elagabalus had a taste for spectacle. He transformed the imperial palace into a carnival of extravagance. Peacocks roamed the halls, banquets lasted days. He reportedly released snakes into the crowd during parties for fun. His chariots were drawn by naked women. He hosted dinner parties where the guests were smothered in rose petals, not gifted smothered. If it sounds like satire, that's because it almost reads like it. But these stories, true or exaggerated, all come from sources grappling with the same question. What happens when Rome is ruled by performance art? He also blurred gender and sexuality in ways that were both provocative and deeply threatening to Rome's rigid social codes. Ancient texts claim he wore makeup, dressed as a woman in private, and even sought to marry a male charioteer. One historian says he tried to have female genitalia surgically constructed, a claim that's impossible to verify, but speaks volumes about the way his reign unsettled traditional Rome. None of this endeared him to the elite. Behind the pageantry, Elagabalus was politically tone-deaf. He sidelined traditional Roman rituals, ignored senatorial advice, and elevated his favorites, often foreign, often ridiculetto, high office. He switched imperial spouses at least 5 times in 4 years. He made his mother and grandmother de facto rulers. He declared his young cousin Severus Alexander heir, then changed his mind, then changed it again. Each decision seemed less like policy and more like impulse. By 222 CE, even his own family had had enough. His grandmother, Julia Maesar, arguably the brains behind his original rise, sided with the Praetorian Guard and orchestrated a coup. Elagabalus and his mother were assassinated. Their bodies were dragged through the streets of Rome, beheaded, and thrown into the Tiber. The Senate promptly erased his name from official records. Statues smashed, coins melted, his temple repurposed. But his memory refused to disappear. Even in disgrace, Elagabalus remains one of Rome's most provocative emperors or ruler who pushed every limit, mocked every norm, and ruled like the empire was his personal theater of the absurd. Was he mad? A rebel? A victim of Roman bigotry? Or simply a teenager given too much power and not enough boundaries? We may never know. But his reign marked the violent end of our list stand, the perfect bookend to a parade of monarchs who remind us that when absolute power meets unchecked ego, history doesn't always repeat its spirals. And so ends the ledger of 30 rulers, kings, queens, emperors who ruled not for their people, but for themselves. Some in blood, some in silence, some in silk, but all in history.